Thank you for downloading the Hong Kong Writers Circle podcast. For more information, please visit our website, hkwriterscircle.com. Welcome to the Hong Kong Writers Circle special podcast series in collaboration with the British Council. In this episode, I interview Sara Wheeler, who will be appearing at the 2017 Hong Kong Book Fair from the 21st to the 23rd of July at the Hong Kong Exhibition and Convention Centre. Event details and registration information are available at britishcouncil.hk. I'm joined by Sara Wheeler for this special episode of the Hong Kong Writers Circle podcast in collaboration with the British Council. Sara is a British travel author and biographer and will be in Hong Kong this summer with the Hong Kong Book Fair. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Hi, from a very rainy London.
So you began your writing career with books about Greece and Chile, but I get the impression that it was your time in Antarctica that made the greatest impression on you. For anyone that doesn't already know, can you fill us in on how you came to be in Antarctica and what works of yours emerged from your time there?
Yes, certainly. In my field of non-fiction, one book does tend to lead to another. And as you say, I wrote a book about Chile, which was a 6-month journey from the top to the bottom. And I thought the bottom was going to be Cape Horn. But it turns out that Chile claims a slice of the Antarctic. So I had to travel down to Chilean Antarctica, as they call it, to complete my portrait of contemporary Chile. I didn't know anything about the Antarctic, but I had this vision when I walked to the top of an ice hill and saw this ice desert, 1.5 times the size of the United States. And I thought, no one's ever written a travel book about this. And there's no indigenous population, so it's the perfect tabula rasa. So I decided that I would set about going there and writing a travel book. And I did. Had I known at the time how difficult it was going to be to get there, I probably wouldn't have had this appetite for the fight. But anyway, I did. And I spent 7 months there and wrote my travel book. And that led on to a biography I'd read the bibliography of the Antarctic and a biography of the man who wrote what I consider to be the masterpiece of polar literature, which is The Worst Journey in the World, by an explorer called Apsley Cherry Garrard. And he went with Captain Scott, but obviously didn't go on the final leg of the journey, obviously, because he came back and wrote his book, The Worst Journey in the World. Anyway, then I went away and did various other things. Wrote some other books, nothing to do with the polar regions. And as I approached the age of 50, I looked back at the Antarctic and thought that was a perfect symbol for a young writer of purity, innocence, a symbol of what the planet could be. It's not owned by anybody. All these claimants, it's ridiculous. Nobody owns it. The claims aren't recognised. It hasn't been mucked up. It's not polluted. We haven't got any of the minerals out. So it was a perfect place for a young writer to write about. Writers have to have hope, And and I was not at all interested in the Arctic, because that's everything that the Antarctic isn't. It's owned. It's not a continent. Where does it start? Where does it end? Everybody's wobbling about that. Whereas, of course, the Antarctic's a perfect continent. It's mucked up. Everybody fighting over it. The hydrocarbon extraction is a nightmare already and set to get worse. The indigenous peoples have all been disenfranchised by various ways by the circumpolar nations. So it's everything that the Antarctic wasn't. But as I say, as I approached 50, I thought, actually, if the Antarctic is a symbol of what the planet could be, the Arctic actually is a symbol of what the planet is, for better or worse. And I think as one sails into middle age, or staggers might be a better verb, you realise there are no solutions, there's only questions. So then I decided to write a travel book about the Arctic, doing various journeys that came to a circumpolar hole to see what I could find. And that ended up that book's called The Magnetic North, and that ended up being about hope as well, really, because you can find hope everywhere if you look hard enough. And despite all the degradation and the problems, the human spirit is still flickering. And that was the hope, really. So that was a sort of the ultimate corollary or partner to my Antarctic book. And I must say, when the Magnetic North was published on publication day, my eldest son said to me, "Mum, how do you feel? You spent so much of your working life writing about the Arctic and Antarctic and the polar regions. How do you feel today? Your Arctic book's published." And I thought about it and I said, I feel relief that there's only 2 polar regions.
I'm aware that, aside from the physical difficulties, of traveling in the Arctic, it was actually logistically difficult to do what you did, to travel between those countries.
Yes, logistics and admin. It was a nightmare, really difficult. I don't do anything tough from an exploration point of view. I don't pull my sledge or lose digits or anything like that. But the administration. But I've written quite a lot about extreme environments, and that's what you have to do. You just have to battle your way through. For example, the Russian Far East, a region called Chukotka, which is beyond Siberia, is closed to foreigners. So I had to somehow insinuate my way, and it takes forever. But the organised anybody who goes to extreme environments will tell you the same thing, whether you're an explorer or a writer.
So I've been reading your latest book, which is Oh My America, which is the story of 6 Victorian women who left England and went to the emerging United States of America, and which is another story of hope. The book's subtitle is Second Acts in a New World. Would you care to explain the subtitle and how hope again emerged as a theme for you?
Yeah. So Second Acts in a New World refers to the fact that these women were all reinventing themselves in a foreign land in middle age. So it's their second act. And that was interesting to me because so often as a woman, I think in probably every country of the world, you're sort of written off and become invisible at middle age. And they got up and did something about it. The New World obviously refers to America. And what interested me was, I've always liked America and felt a great affinity with it. And I wanted to write about the 19th century when it was becoming itself. Basically, the book covers 1827 to 1877, 1877 being the time when the Transcontinental Railway linked the whole country together, so it became itself. But during those 50 years, when my girls, as I call them, were there, the frontier was pushing further and further west. There was a frontier. It was all unknown. A new world was being forged. And so that's what the subtitle refers to. 5 of the 6 were writers, so that really appealed to me as a sense of identity. And I find it very hopeful they could find these new lives. For example, Fanny Trollope, who was Anthony's mother, she went to Cincinnati in 1827. That's really early to go to America. She went from economic necessity, as most of my girls did, not, swanning around with an inheritance. They went out of economic necessity. Fanny Trollope's whole project, she took some of her kids with her, not Anthony, was an absolute disaster. And she came home almost destitute and sat down and thought, I'm going to write a book about this. And she wrote a book called Domestic Manners of the Americans, which has been a bestseller ever since. It made her a star. So there was redemption in her suffering. And they all had that in various ways, different ways they all went to escape suffering, pain of one kind or another, economic, emotional, whatever. One of them was Jane Austen's niece, and her husband had gone bonkers and left her with 3 little kids, and she brought them up and just wanted to get away from a situation which had been extremely bad for her for many years. So I find great redemption in the story of these brave pioneers who went without a bloke by their side. Well, one of them actually went with her husband, and they were homesteaders who went to plough the soil in Illinois, which was just empty land then, with loads of kids and doing everything by hand and virtually no cash. But the others didn't have a man by their side. One of them was the explorer Isabella Bird, who went, among other things, horseback riding across the plains of Colorado and through the mountains of Colorado. And she wrote lots of books about it, and she became a very distinguished lady traveller of the Victorian kind. So I just found all their stories gripping. It was the subtitle of the book was No Surrender. Don't give up, just keep going. It's life after 50.
You mentioned writing the life of Apsley Cherry Garrard, and you have also written a biography of Dennis Finch Hatton, both of whom are concerned with writing, the former being a writer, as you mentioned, and the latter being the subject of a book, Out of Africa. Is the writerly connection important for you when choosing your subjects?
Yes, it is, because I think as a writer, one understands other writers. I sort of know what they're on about, and I know what it is to be a writer. Although, as you point out, Dennis Finch Hatton wasn't a writer. It's just that he was immortalised in Karen Blixen's His Lover's book, Out of Africa. Oh, that's a very that's a very partial portrait. Why shouldn't it be? I think that with him, what interested me was the relationship with landscape, and travel writers in particular, and to a certain extent other kinds of writers too. The relationship with landscape is very important. So in both of those figures, Dennis Finch Hatton and Cherry, as Cherry Garrard was known, one knows that from the few extant letters that Finch Hatton responded very profoundly to the East African landscape, and he kept going back there. And that's why he got a little gypsy moth, because he loved looking it down and seeing these teeming hordes of wildebeest and other animals like water flowing over the plains. And Karen Blixen wrote very movingly about that when she went up with him. So writers, yes, but also I think this connection between the landscape and the imagination is something I like to investigate and think about and write about. And of course, one can always identify with that because everybody has some kind of relationship with landscape.
This podcast, and indeed much of what the Hong Kong Writers' Circle does, is concerned with the craft of writing. In my previous interview with Tim Moore, he mentioned using a smartphone to record audio notes, which then had to be transcribed later on. Is this in any way similar for you? And what is your writing process like?
Yeah, well, on the road, I use notebooks because you have to. And anyway, in extreme environments, no matter what kit you've got, the cold sucks the juice out of your batteries in 2 seconds flat, so you can forget it. And forget a Kindle likewise. If there's just two of you in a tent, you're not going to have a generator or anything like that. So it's notebooks. And I usually have a sort of robust hardback notebook with thin lines and no margins. I'm not saying I'm ritualistic. And I write up my notes every evening, and you've got to do it thoroughly every evening. You think you're going to remember the details and you don't. But if I'm out all day, I usually have a little notebook as well where you just scribble keywords. You have to. Just literally, whether you're on a plane or on the back of a truck or on the back of a snowmobile, just scribble keywords down. Get the notes written up every evening. Of course, even writing notes can be perilous when it's minus 40 because your pens tend to snap, or the ink freezes and the lead snaps as well, and you have to sleep with pencils and so on. Indeed, your notebook sort of inside the sleeping bag with you to stop them freezing. But anyway, one manages it. And so you get home, and then, yes, the dread word transcript. I do, in fact, type up all my notes before I think about even writing, just because I think you've always got them. You've got them there in a legible form to refer to in the future. And I look back at notebooks now for 15 years ago. You know, I've got them all labelled on my shelf, and you can see them up there with a label on the spine saying where it was and what year. Then after the notes are transcribed, it's time to write a skeleton plan. And what generally happens is I'll do a real skeleton and then fill in lots of bits and arrows and this and that. So I've got a fuller plan. And then once I feel I'm ready to go, start writing. And the plan gets amended as I go along. So there'll generally be a bigger one. I've often got it pinned on the wall. And the things evolve, you know, and some themes one's decided in advance, and some themes emerge as you go along.
In the introduction to Oh My America, you write, where is it? I did not choose these particular characters in order to prove a theory. It was a more instinctive selection based on feelings of sympathy and empathetic mockery. I wonder whether this has always been the case, that your themes emerge naturally from your subjects.
I knew it was second acts, and I knew I didn't want to go beyond 1877. And I knew I wanted to have a reasonable geographical spread. You know, I didn't want 6 in California. And in fact, until quite late on, I only had 5, and then another one presented. Well, it was really this pioneer, this homesteader I told you about, because I thought to paint a picture of European women in America in the mid-19th century, it would be perverse not to find a homesteader, but of course they were the kind of people who didn't have time to write anything. But this one I found for Illinois, Rebecca, her name was, Rebecca Burland. In old age, she had dictated a memoir to her eldest son, which exists. I mean, I don't think you can buy it, but it exists in the British Library. And it just gave me enough to hold on to. And when the internet's a wonderful thing, she left, I think, 6 children when she died, still in Illinois there. And I thought, well, Burland's quite an unusual name. And within 2 hours, I was having email correspondence with her great, whatever it was, grandson, who was a Burland. And he sent me a photograph of him between her and her husband's gravestones. And was able to tell me a bit about how the land had evolved and all the rest of it. In many cases, of course, when you're writing about extreme environments like the Antarctic or like the American deserts, the great thing is, or the California mountains, nothing's changed particularly. What Cherry Garrard saw when he looked out of his tent is the same as I saw. Whereas somebody who was in New York, in a little house, that's going to be a multi-story car park now, and you can't write about that. So you just have to try and conjure the landscape when you can, and if not, rely on old photographs, old maps, and sort of piece things together.
You're visiting Hong Kong as part of the Hong Kong Book Fair, and your visit has been organised by the British Council. Will this be your first time in Hong Kong?
No, I've been a couple of times before, but sort of kind of flying visits both times. I spent 6 weeks in China a few years ago and did a wonderful 3 days in Hong Kong first, which I really enjoyed. I've never written about it, so who knows? Who knows?
So I always ask my interviewees for their top 5 writing tips for members of the Hong Kong Writers Circle. I wonder if you would care to share yours.
Yes, certainly. Number 1, read all the time. Number 2, plan your structure from the outset. You can always change it later, but don't sit down with a blank screen and sort of go, bleh. You need to plan your structure from the outset. And I think actually that's particularly important with travel writing. With biography, you might feel, if you're doing cradle to grave, which almost everybody does, you might feel, well, that's my structure, which is sort of it. So that's a little bit different. Number 3, clarity is the most important thing in prose. Somebody asked Flaubert what the 3 most important things were in writing, and he said clarity, clarity, and clarity. And one thing you might do, as an effort to achieve that, is read your work aloud to yourself, just to yourself. Because sometimes things jar in the ear, that you can't see on the page. Number 4, avoid the passive tense. I always go through stuff, taking out the passive tense, almost always. And it's amazing what a difference it makes. And that does mean that if there's one occasion where you think, actually, I really want to conjure the fact that something happened to him, then passive can help you. But apart from that, take the passive tense out. And when you think you've finished, go through and take out 3/4 of the adjectives. And I don't want any of those adjectives like little, big, beautiful, wonderful. They don't mean anything. You must never use it. I mean, I feel if you use the word beautiful, what does it mean? It means nothing. You've got to show them it's beautiful by conjuring the landscape on a page. You've got to make them see, hear, smell, taste, and feel, but not all at the same time.
Thank you. They are excellent tips, especially for me, I got to say. Can you tell me something about your next project?
Yes, certainly. I've been taking an awfully long time over a book about Russia. It's the story of the golden age of Russian literature, so Pushkin to the death of Tolstoy, but woven around my journeys in contemporary Russia, not Moscow and Petersburg, which I'm not very interested in, but the other places where the other 160 million live. And it's kind of little biographies of those writers, all of whom I worship. And looking for themes of theirs that link in to Russia today, of which in fact there are loads, and descriptions of Russia and little snapshots of contemporary Russia. And I do a lot of homestays, which are always sort of on the 5th floor of a 50s block, where everybody watches television and moans about Ukraine over Facebook, and you get a real insight into how people do live and the sort of desperate plight of the Russian people since the dawn of time until now. was wrestling with the second chapter just before I was on the phone to you, and I've got to keep going. So I'm going to have a rule in Hong Kong that we're 2 hours a day. Another tip, actually, let's add a sixth one, is I think it's really important when you're actually writing to do something every day. And I'm a great believer in rules, and 2 hours a day, or even half an hour a day if you can't manage it, every day, including Christmas Day, including when you're on holiday, you keep in touch with it. And it's cumulative. If you go away, it's like if you're a runner, you go away for a few weeks and don't do it. It's really painful when you come back. So keep in touch with it, and you do, if you're sitting looking at it, you do.
So you will be appearing, as I say, at the Hong Kong Book Fair, and I'm going to just mention the events at which you're appearing. So we have you will be in conversation with Kate Whitehead at the Hong Kong Exhibition and Convention Centre. That is on Friday the 21st of July. The next day, on the Saturday, you will be holding a travel writing workshop at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. And the day after that, the Sunday, you will be in a panel discussion with Tim Moore and also a local journalist, Chip Chow, at the Exhibition Centre. So you're going to be pretty busy, but we're still going to hold you to your 2 hours a day.
Yeah, okay. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm hoping to catch some other events when I'm there.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time out to speak to me today on this podcast. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
The Hong Kong Writers Circle podcast, episode 29, Sara Wheeler, Times British Council, was produced by me, Simon Overton. For more information about this show and all of our other activities, please visit our website, hkwriterscircle.com. Oh My America, Second Acts in a New World is by Sara Wheeler and published by Vintage. The interview with Sara Wheeler and her appearance at the Hong Kong Book Fair 2017 was organised by the British Council. The podcast theme music was Jingle Jazz by Quantum Jazz from the album End of Line, used under the terms of a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 license. If you are an author, publisher or musician and would like to collaborate on an episode of this podcast, or for any other feedback, please email hello@hkwriterscircle.com and use the subject line podcast. If you are subscribed to this podcast on iTunes, please consider giving the show a customer rating, as this can help to build our audience and gain exposure for our writers. Thanks as always to Katrina Tay for the podcast artwork.